You think I trapped you?" Tanisha's voice cracked across the cold marble of Duke Lindsay's office. Her chest rose and fell, her hand pressed against her still flat stomach, trembling but firm. The Manhattan skyline loomed behind him through the tall glass windows, glowing like a silent jury. Her words echoed through the space, raw and piercing. Duke stood motionless, his sharp suit failing to mask the weakness creeping into his body. His blue eyes narrowed, filled with the weight of anger and fear. His pride would not let him answer, but his silence struck harder than any insult. Tanisha's throat burned with the sting of betrayal. "I am carrying your heir, Duke, your son, and you dare call me a gold digger?" Her words cut the air like broken glass. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the faint hum of traffic far below, muffled by glass. Two lives, worlds apart, stood clashing in one room. She, a young woman who had fought for every scrap of dignity life offered. He, a man whose empire touched the clouds, but who couldn't escape the shadows of grief and mistrust. The storm between them was not about wealth. It was about trust, about truth, about a man who feared being deceived and a woman who refused to be belittled. Her shoulders shook, not from weakness but from the rage of being accused of chasing something she never asked for. Duke's lips pressed together, his chest rising with the unspoken words of a man too afraid to admit how much he wanted to believe her. The city lights beyond the glass windows glittered like cold stars. They were witnesses to a moment that would decide everything: the future of a billion-dollar empire, the fate of a child not yet born, and the fragile thread binding two people torn between love and suspicion. Before we continue, would you forgive someone who doubted your love? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like this video. It helps us reach more people. The tension hung heavy in the room, and with that, the story rewinds, pulling us back to the night when Tanisha, Brooks and Duke Lindsay's paths crossed for the very first time. The moment froze. Tanisha's voice, sharp with pain, lingered in the air as though the walls themselves held their breath. Her accusation was not only against Duke Lindsay but against the assumptions that had shadowed her since she was old enough to know men rarely saw past beauty. To understand the weight of that clash, you have to know who they were before that day. Duke Lindsay was not just another wealthy man. He was the founder of Lindsay Capital, the mind behind skyscrapers that pierced New York's skyline. To the outside world, he was the symbol of ambition fulfilled, the widower, whose tragic loss only made him more stoic, more unreachable. Behind closed doors, though, his body betrayed him. Rumors spread across Wall Street of a terminal illness. Whispers said he had months left, a year if fate allowed. The empire he had built stood firm, but the man at its center was breaking. His greatest fear was not death. It was leaving behind a legacy without an heir to carry his name. Tanisha Brooks could not have lived a life more different. At 24, she worked double shifts at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, balancing trays of champagne for men whose watches cost more than her monthly rent. Each tip went toward paying for her online classes in business administration. She dreamed of building her own path, of one day standing at the head of a boardroom, not because of who she married, but because of what she earned. Her mother's warning echoed in her every choice. Men will see your face first, your body next, and your heart last. Guard your heart, Tanisha. So she guarded it with steel. She laughed when required, kept conversations light, but let no one too close. On the surface, their worlds never should have touched. One carried wealth that stretched across continents, the other carried bills that piled on a kitchen counter in Brooklyn. One sought a child to continue a dynasty, the other sought only dignity and a chance to stand on her own 2 feet. Yet fate pushed them into the same room one night, forcing two guarded souls to collide. Back in that office, the air between them was charged, two lives colliding with no middle ground. Tanisha's eyes glistened, but she refused to bow her head. She had worked too hard to let anyone, billionaire or not, strip her of her worth. Duke's silence was not born of arrogance, but of fear. Fear that his judgment had failed him once again. Fear that trusting her meant surrendering control of everything he had built. He had lost before, to illness, to grief, to time, and he could not bear another loss. Yet looking at her now, he saw more strength in her defiance than in the polished faces of board members who surrounded him daily. The tension between them was more than a quarrel. It was the weight of history pressing on both shoulders. He saw her as a threat to his empire. She saw him as a man too trapped in his pride to recognize honesty when it stared him down. Her words cut through the silence once more. This child is mine whether you believe me or not. But don't mistake my silence for weakness, Duke. I will raise him without your help if I must." For a moment, the billionaire CEO, powerful, feared, untouchable, looked smaller than he ever had. Not because of his illness, but because he stood before a woman who refused to break. That was the heart of their story. Not wealth, not status, but whether two broken souls could trust each other long enough to build something real. And that's where this journey begins. Before judgment, before accusations, before betrayal, there was a night in Manhattan when their paths crossed for the first time. A night neither of them expected, but one that would change everything. Before we step back into that moment, I want to ask you, if someone accused you of lying about love, would you fight to prove them wrong or walk away? Drop your answer in the comments. And don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find these stories. Now, let's return to where it all started. The first night Tanisha Brooks met Duke Lindsay, the widower, billionaire, whose empire stretched into the sky, but whose heart was still buried in the past. The hum of conversation, the clink of crystal glasses, and the soft notes of piano music wrapped around Le Baradin like velvet. For most, this was a sanctuary of luxury. For Tanisha Brooks, it was another battlefield she fought nightly. At 24, she carried trays balanced with wine bottles that cost more than her monthly rent. Her steps were precise, practiced, the result of months working double shifts to keep the bills at bay. By day, she was a student, her laptop propped on a worn desk in her tiny Brooklyn apartment as she chipped away at a degree in business administration. By night, she slipped into black heels and a fitted uniform that kept her anonymous among the sea of servers in Manhattan's elite dining room. Her coworkers knew her as efficient, focused, and sharp. She didn't linger with guests or laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She came in, clocked in, and did her job. Nothing more, nothing less. For Tanisha, each night on the floor wasn't just about tips. It was about time that could have gone into studying, resting, or dreaming. But dreams didn't pay rent. Tuition bills didn't disappear. Still, she kept her head high. Her mother's words stayed with her every shift. Men will see your face first, your body next, and your heart last. Guard your heart, Tanisha. So she wore her guard like armor. Customers saw her warm smile, but they didn't see the exhaustion. Tucked behind it, they heard her soft voice, but not the steel edge she kept hidden for anyone who crossed the line. Le Baradin was a stage where power dined every night. Politicians, CEOs, media moguls, they filled the tables with their laughter, their arrogance, and their expectations. Many saw the staff as decoration, background to their expensive evenings. Tanisha refused to let herself be reduced to that. She worked with efficiency, but drew clear lines. She didn't flirt for tips. She didn't gossip with coworkers about wealthy clients. She kept her dignity, even when tired feet begged her to quit. Between shifts, she thought about her future. The long nights poured into a goal larger than herself, to own a business one day. Her degree wasn't just paper. It was freedom. She wanted to prove that she could build her life without shortcuts, without leaning on anyone else's name. And so, when the maitre d' motioned for her to handle one of the corner tables, that night, Tanisha tucked her notepad into her apron and squared her shoulders. Another table, another client, another night of work before logging into her laptop at dawn to continue the grind. She didn't know that the man waiting at that table would pull her into a story that would shake everything she thought she knew about control, trust, and love. The dinner rush had reached its peak. Servers glided between tables with polished precision. Sommeliers poured wine under the glow of chandeliers, and the maitre d' whispered updates into discreet earpieces. Le Baradin thrived on order, on maintaining the illusion that nothing ever broke the rhythm. Then the room shifted. It wasn't loud, no announcement was made, but the moment Duke Lindsay stepped through the entrance, the atmosphere bent around him. Heads turned almost instinctively. Staff stiffened. Even regular patrons who rarely lifted their eyes from menus glanced toward the tall figure in a tailored charcoal suit. Duke Lindsay, one of the younger servers muttered under their breath, nearly tripping over a tray. He's here. Everyone knew the name. Founder of Lindsay Capital, billionaire developer, a man whose skyline projects had reshaped Manhattan and beyond. Yet it wasn't just his wealth that drew whispers. He carried a reputation carved out of loss and secrecy. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and since then he appeared rarely in public. When he did, it was usually at board meetings or charity events where photographs captured his sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and the grief etched behind them. Tonight, though, there was no camera flashing in his face, no investors trailing behind. It was just him, walking with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The maitre d' straightened his jacket nervously and moved to greet him, voice hush but hurried. "Mr. Lindsay, what an honor." Duke gave a polite nod, his voice low and even. A table. Something quiet. He didn't request the most prominent seat in the room. Instead, he chose the corner by the tall windows, away from curious eyes. Yet that didn't stop the staff from whispering as he passed. "They say he's sick. No, I heard he's remarried in secret. Please, look at him. He doesn't look like a man with much time left." Tanisha caught fragments as she adjusted her tray. Gossip. Always gossip. She had no interest in wealthy men's rumors. Still, she found her eyes drawn to him. Unlike the boisterous regulars who barked orders, Duke moved with a quiet gravity. There was no arrogance in his posture, just a weight that made the air around him feel heavier. When he sat down, sliding the menu onto the table without opening it, the maitre d' scanned the room, searching for the right server to assign. His eyes landed on Tanisha. She stiffened. "You," he said softly, as if sensing her competence. "Table 12. Her pulse quickened. Another client, she told herself. Nothing more. She tucked her notepad into her apron and walked toward him, unaware that her life was about to veer off course in a way no business textbook could have prepared her for. Tanisha steadied her breathing as she approached the corner table. She had served men of power before, and most of them carried their wealth like armor. They expected the world to orbit them, and the staff often indulged it, laughing too loudly at dull jokes, offering suggestions only to flatter. She had learned to keep her distance, polite but never personal. "Good evening," she said, her tone calm, practiced. "Would you like to start with a drink?" Duke lifted his gaze from the city lights beyond the window. His eyes were a striking shade of blue, clear yet shadowed with something deeper. When they landed on hers, Tanisha felt a pause, as though he was measuring more than her words. "What do you recommend?" His voice was low, steady, not sharp with entitlement but edged with fatigue. She blinked. Few men at this level asked for her opinion. They told, they instructed, they demanded. Yet here he was, waiting for her answer as though it mattered. "The Merlot pairs well with the sea bass," she replied, careful not to let her surprise show. He didn't question it. "Then bring me that." Closing the menu without another glance, he leaned back in his chair. The gesture wasn't dismissive, more like surrender. Most guests clung to control, fussing over pairings and details. He handed it away, as though trusting her choice was a relief. When she returned with the wine, his eyes followed her carefully, not in the way that made her skin crawl but with a quiet focus. He let silence linger before speaking again. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "Too long," Tanisha said before catching herself. Normally she would keep her answers clipped, neutral, but something in his tone invited honesty. "Too long," he repeated, the faintest curve at the corner of his lips. "And yet you still managed to smile." She didn't know what to make of him. Most men of his standing treated smiles as currency, something to buy with oversized tips. He seemed curious, almost searching. "Smiling is part of the uniform," she replied, adjusting her tray. "Is it?" His gaze lingered on her face, then dropped briefly, almost thoughtfully, before returning to her eyes. "Because it doesn't look practiced. It looks real." Tanisha stiffened slightly, caught off guard by the observation. She wanted to brush it aside, to retreat into the shield she wore around every guest. But a part of her, small but undeniable, recognized something in him, a crack in the surface that mirrored one of her own. She cleared her throat, bringing the conversation back to business. "Your entree will be out shortly." "Thank you," he said simply, but the weight in his tone felt heavier than the words. For the first time that night, Tanisha felt unsettled, not by arrogance, but by the possibility that Duke Lindsay saw more than she wanted him to. Tanisha returned with his entree, careful not to let her thoughts drift. She set the plate before him with practiced ease, the aroma of seared sea bass rising gently between them. "Your meal," she said, stepping back to give him space. Duke studied the plate for a moment, then glanced up. "You recommended this?" She nodded once. "It's a house favorite." He picked up his fork, but paused again. "Do you eat here after your shifts?" The question caught her off guard. No guest had ever asked her that before. Servers didn't exist to them, outside these walls. "I don't," she admitted. Can't afford it. Something flickered in his expression. Discomfort, maybe regret. Most men of his class might laugh or offer a condescending joke. Duke didn't. Instead, he lowered his gaze, as if quietly reminded of the gulf between their worlds. "You should," he said finally. "If anyone deserves it, it's the people carrying this place on their shoulders." For the first time, Tanisha softened. His words weren't laced with pity but sincerity. She didn't know whether to believe him, but the tone was genuine. As the night progressed, she found herself watching him more closely. He didn't pull out a phone to flaunt emails. He didn't rush the staff with impatience. Instead, he ate slowly, pausing often, his eyes straying to the window or back to her when she passed. There was weariness in him, but also restraint, like a man holding back 1,000 things he couldn't say. When she returned to refill his glass, their eyes met again. Something stirred, small, subtle, but undeniable. His gaze wasn't one of possession or casual desire. It was searching, almost questioning, as though he was trying to understand who she was beneath the uniform. "Do you always work nights?" he asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. "School during the day, shifts at night." He leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth pulling into a faint smile. "So you're building something for yourself?" The way he said it carried no mockery. It wasn't small talk. It was recognition. Tanisha held his gaze a second longer than she meant to. "That's the goal," she replied softly. That pause, unspoken but thick with meaning, was the first spark neither of them wanted to admit. It wasn't a declaration, not even a flirtation, but it was there, pressing at the edges of caution. As she walked away to tend another table, she caught herself breathing, a little faster, her heart knocking once, hard, before steadying again. For Duke, it was the first time in years he felt something beyond grief or duty. For Tanisha, it was the first time in months she felt seen, not as a server, not as a stranger, but as a woman with her own path. Neither named it, but both felt it. By the time Duke finished his meal, the dining room had begun to thin. The soft hum of conversation faded, replaced by the quiet clatter of servers resetting tables for the next day. Tanisha stacked menus at the podium, trying to ignore the pull of his gaze from across the room. When she returned to clear his table, Duke rested his hand lightly on the edge of the plate, stopping her for just a moment. "You've been patient with me," he said. Her brow lifted. "That's my job." "Not like that," he countered. His voice dropped, low enough that only she could hear. "Most people either rush me or linger for what they think they'll gain. You didn't do either." Tanisha hesitated, caught between pride and curiosity. "I don't mix work with whatever this is." He studied her face carefully, then released the plate. "Fair enough." She collected the dishes and stepped away, expecting that to be the end of it. But when she clocked out an hour later and slipped her coat over her shoulders, she saw him. Again, standing near the entrance, one hand in his pocket, the other adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Her step slowed. "Still here?" His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "I didn't want to leave without asking." "Asking what?" she challenged. "Let me drive you home." His words were simple, but there was weight behind them. Not pushy, not casual, just direct. Tanisha froze. The staff whispered often about wealthy men who toyed with servers, offering rides that led to whispered scandals. She wasn't about to become another story traded in break rooms. "I don't need a ride," she said firmly. "I didn't say you needed one," Duke replied evenly. "I said I wanted to offer." The confidence in his tone wasn't arrogant. It was steady, respectful. Still, her instincts warned her. "People will talk," she muttered. "People always talk," he said without hesitation. "Let them." For a moment, the silence stretched between them. He stood, waiting, but not pressing. She weighed her options: the subway ride back to Brooklyn at midnight, crowded and weary, or the black town car idling outside. Her heart raced, though not entirely from suspicion. She saw something in his face that she hadn't noticed before, loneliness buried beneath the polish. Finally, she exhaled, her voice low but clear. "Fine, but only to Brooklyn Heights, no detours." A flicker of relief passed through his expression, so quick she nearly missed it. He gestured toward the door. "Brooklyn Heights. It is." As they stepped into the crisp night air, Tanisha's pulse thudded in her ears. She told herself it was convenience, nothing more. Yet deep down, she knew this decision would follow her long after tonight. The town car pulled away from the glittering streets of Midtown, slipping into the steady rhythm of Manhattan traffic. Inside, silence hung between them, not uncomfortable but charged with the weight of an unspoken question. Why had she said yes? Tanisha sat with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the blur of lights rushing past the tinted windows. She told herself it was nothing, just a ride, a favor she hadn't asked for, one she didn't intend to repeat. Yet her chest felt tight, each breath shallow as though the car carried more than just two passengers. Duke leaned slightly against the leather seat, studying her profile in the dim glow of passing street lamps. She was different from the women who usually crossed his path. There was no pretense, no mask of charm. She hadn't softened her answers to please him, hadn't stretched her smiles to keep him comfortable. For a man who had lived years surrounded by insincerity, that honesty struck deeper than he expected. When the car crossed into Brooklyn, Tanisha's guard rose higher. She didn't want him to see the chipped paint on her building or the worn stairs that led to her apartment. She didn't want him to pity her. More than that, she didn't want him to think he had found a weakness to exploit. As the car slowed near her block, she turned to him, her voice even. "This doesn't mean anything. You offered me a ride and I took it, that's all." He didn't argue. He didn't try to press for more. Instead, he gave a small nod, his eyes steady on hers. Understood. The driver stopped. Tanisha reached for the handle, pausing when Duke spoke again. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. She froze, her hand resting on the door. "Who? Someone I used to trust." His words carried no explanation, but the heaviness in his tone made her pulse stumble. She stepped out without responding, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. The car lingered a moment before disappearing into the night, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, staring after it with a mixture of relief and unease. Inside, Duke leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had no reason to return to this restaurant, no reason to see her again. But something told him he would. Sometimes the first impression you have of someone is the one that matters most. You think you know them at a glance, rich, poor, trustworthy, dangerous. But you never truly know until life forces you to see beyond the surface. Have you ever judged someone at first sight and been proven wrong? Share below. Your story might be closer to Tanisha and Duke's than you realize. With that question hanging in the air, their story had only just begun. The car door shut with a muted click, sealing Tanisha inside the quiet cocoon of Duke Lindsay's world. Outside, December bit hard at the city streets, the wind carrying flurries that clung to the sidewalks. Inside the sleek black town car, the leather seats, soft lighting, and gentle hum of the engine wrapped them in an uneasy silence. Tanisha sat stiffly, her back pressed against the seat, her eyes fixed on the blur of Manhattan lights as the car pulled into traffic. She gripped her purse in her lap like a shield, reminding herself this ride was temporary. One night, one ride, nothing more. Duke sat across from her, angled slightly toward the window. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about him, an exhaustion that clung to his features. Even in stillness, he carried the weight of a man used to control, though tonight his silence seemed heavier than authority. The driver asked for directions, and Tanisha spoke quickly. "Brooklyn Heights." Duke turned then, his gaze steady. "That's a long ride." Her tone was clipped, her chin lifting. "If you're worried about the distance, you don't have to take me." He studied her for a beat before replying. "I didn't say that. I meant, are you sure you want me to know where you live?" The question struck her like a small challenge. She wasn't naive. She knew the power imbalance, but she refused to let him think she was afraid. If you were dangerous, you wouldn't be sitting in a chauffeured car with your name stamped on half the skyline. A faint curve tugged at his lips. Fair point. The car slipped onto FDR Drive, the East River glinting beyond the glass. Neon billboards flashed past, reflecting across the window and briefly softening his face. Tanisha caught the expression in that glow, distant, almost haunted. For all his wealth, he looked less like a man reveling in power and more like someone burdened by something he couldn't shake. She shifted slightly, her guard firm. Whatever his troubles were, they weren't hers. This was a ride, nothing more. Yet, as the bridge loomed ahead and the skyline receded behind them, a strange awareness filled the space. They were no longer server and customer. They were simply two people trapped in the silence of a winter night, carrying secrets neither had yet spoken aloud. The car glided smoothly along the highway, the muted hum of the tires filling the silence. Tanisha kept her eyes on the city lights fading in the distance, determined not to be the one to break it. She had spent years learning when to speak and when to hold her tongue, and with men like Duke Lindsay, silence was safer. But Duke didn't seem content with silence. His voice cut through gently, low but direct. You didn't ask for a tip tonight. Her head turned sharply. Excuse me? Most people do it without words, he said evenly, his gaze fixed on her. They linger, refill my glass before I ask, laugh at things that aren't funny, all for the same reason. But you didn't. You did your job, and you walked away. Tanisha's grip on her purse tightened, maybe because I was doing exactly that. My job, not auditioning for someone's attention. Duke leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in irritation but in thought. That's unusual. She bristled. Why? Because I didn't play into whatever game you're used to. The faintest smile ghosted across his lips. Because it's real, and I don't see much of that anymore. Tanisha shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. She wasn't flattered, she was wary. Too many men had used different as the opening line to pull her closer. She wasn't about to fall for that. You say that like you expect people to perform for you, she replied coolly. His eyes flicked toward the window briefly before returning to hers. In my world, they usually do. She studied him for a moment. There was no arrogance in his tone, only fact. And that made her uneasy. Men who were used to being served rarely knew what to do with someone who didn't bow. Well, I'm not in your world, she said firmly, leaning back against the seat. A pause followed, heavy but not hostile. Duke didn't push. Instead, his expression softened in a way she didn't expect. I know. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He wasn't denying the divide between them. He was acknowledging it, as though he understood the line she was drawing and chose not to cross it. For the first time since stepping into the car, Tanisha felt his honesty disarm her, even as she clung to her guard. The car settled into a quieter stretch of road, the rhythm of the city softening as they neared the bridge. For a moment, only the muted hum of the engine filled the space. Tanisha thought the conversation was done, but Duke's voice broke through again, quieter this time. You asked why I sound tired, he said, his gaze fixed on the glass. She frowned. You didn't say it, he corrected, but you looked at me like you noticed. Tanisha shifted in her seat, unsure how to answer. She had noticed. The weariness in his face wasn't from a long day at the office. It was deeper. He didn't wait for her response. Doctors gave me 6 months, a year if I'm lucky. The words landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Tanisha blinked, her throat tightening. She searched his face, expecting a smirk, a cruel test, some kind of manipulation, but there was no sarcasm in his tone. His jaw was set, his eyes shadowed, his voice raw. You're sick? She asked carefully. He gave a short nod. Terminal, no cure. Money buys time, not miracles. Her stomach nodded. She had expected arrogance from him, maybe flirtation, but not this. Vulnerability wasn't what powerful men handed out freely. Duke shifted, his voice low but steady. I've built everything I dreamed of, towers, wealth, a name that carries weight. But none of it matters when I'm gone. The board will strip it for parts. Strangers will profit off my work. He paused, his gaze locking on hers. Unless I leave an heir. Tanisha inhaled sharply, her fingers curling into her coat. An heir? The word tasted bitter on her tongue. His expression didn't falter. Someone to carry my name, my legacy, not the company, me. What I was, who I am. The honesty in his tone unnerved her more than the confession itself. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't even asking. He was stating a truth, one that exposed him completely. Tanisha turned toward the window, the city flashing past in streaks of light. She clenched her jaw, her heart hammering with a mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't the illness that rattled her most. It was the idea that a man like Duke Lindsay could look at her and see not a woman, but a solution. Tanisha's chest rose and fell sharply as Duke's words settled into the quiet of the car. An heir, that was what he was talking about. Not love, not companionship, but blood, legacy, inheritance. Her eyes narrowed, and she snapped her gaze back to him. So that's why you wanted to give me a ride, to size me up, to see if I'd be willing to carry your child like some contract? Duke flinched at her tone, but he didn't back down. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. Her voice cracked, anger threading through every syllable. Do you know how insulting that is? To reduce me to nothing more than a body to keep your empire alive. The driver's eyes flicked up at the rearview mirror, sensing the tension, but wisely said nothing. Duke's jaw tightened, his voice even but strained. I wasn't asking you. I was telling you what I face. Why people look at me the way they do. Every woman who comes near me is accused of wanting the same thing. Money, my name, my will. I've learned not to trust. Tanisha leaned forward, her voice sharp as glass. Then maybe you should learn to see past your own fears. Because not every woman is waiting to trap you. Some of us actually work for what we want. Her hand pressed against her purse, the leather digging into her palm as if to anchor her. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone, make her feel small. I pour wine until my hands ache. I study until my eyes burn. I fight every single day to prove that I can build my life without leaning on someone else's fortune. Her voice lowered, but the strength behind it only grew. So don't you dare look at me and think for a second that I would trade my dignity for your billions. For a long moment, silence stretched. Duke's gaze remained on her, unflinching, though something in his eyes flickered, something that looked dangerously close to regret. Tanisha turned back toward the window, her heart racing. She had made her point. Whatever he thought of her before this night, he would know now. Tanisha Brooks was not a pawn in anyone's game. The car was silent again, but this time it wasn't the strained quiet of strangers. It was heavier, filled with the weight of truths laid bare. Duke leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on Tanisha, though she refused to meet them. Her profile was sharp against the glow of the passing streetlights, jaw clenched, chin lifted, eyes fierce even as they stared stubbornly at the world beyond the glass. Most people bowed under his name. They softened their words, hid their intentions, or leaned into the roles he unconsciously assigned them. But she hadn't. Tanisha had taken his confession, his illness, his fears, and instead of pitying him or using them to her advantage, she stood taller, sharper, unyielding. You're angry, he said quietly, his tone lacking defensiveness this time. She turned to him then, her eyes blazing. Of course I'm angry. You sit across from me, talking about legacies and heirs like I'm some empty page waiting for your story to be written on it. I have my own story, my own battles, my own future. Her words should have stung, but instead, something shifted inside him. For years he had been surrounded by people who nodded and agreed, people who took without hesitation or lied to his face while pretending loyalty. Tanisha wasn't like them. She didn't shrink from him. She didn't beg for favors or show false sympathy. She was honest, brutally so. And strangely, that honesty soothed him. I don't know why I told you any of this, Duke admitted, his voice rough. But I did. Maybe because I knew you'd answer me without bending. Maybe because you don't want anything from me. Her brow furrowed, suspicion still etched in her features. You shouldn't mistake honesty for weakness. I'm not here to fix your life. His lips tugged in the faintest trace of a smile. I know. That's what makes you different. The words hung in the air, softer than the rest, as if he hadn't meant to speak them aloud. As the car slowed toward Brooklyn Heights, Duke realized something unsettling, for the first time in years he felt like he was in the presence of someone who couldn't be bought, swayed, or controlled. A woman who demanded to be seen, not used. And for a man who had been surrounded by walls of mistrust, Tanisha, Brooks's integrity struck him harder than his illness ever could. The following week at La Bernardine unfolded like any other. Tanisha balancing trays, reciting specials with a practiced rhythm, dodging entitled demands with calm precision. But by Friday night, she noticed a shift ripple through the staff. The maitre d's voice dropped to a hush, servers straightened their posture, and whispers threaded through the room. He was back. Duke Lindsay walked in, commanding the same quiet attention he had before. No entourage, no partner at his side. Just him. The maitre d' rushed forward, offering him the choice of any table, but Duke's eyes swept the room until they landed on her. Tanisha's chest tightened. She told herself it was coincidence, that he was here for the food, not for her. But when the maitre d' gestured toward an open seat, Duke shook his head. I'll wait. I want her section. His voice was calm, leaving no room for argument. The maitre d' hesitated only briefly before nodding. Of course, Mr. Lindsay. Her co-workers shot her curious looks, a mix of envy and suspicion. For them, serving Duke meant tips larger than their weekly rent. For Tanisha, it meant questions she didn't want answered. When she approached his table, pen poised, she kept her tone clipped. Good evening, sir. Back again? Duke met her gaze, steady but unreadable. Yes. You'll be disappointed if you're expecting the same meal, she said, trying to lighten the moment. We rotate the menu. I'm not here for the meal. His reply was simple, direct. Her pen stilled over the notepad. She wanted to push back, to tell him she didn't have time for games. But before she could speak, he added, I came because of the way you looked at me, like I was a man, not a headline. Tanisha blinked, caught off guard. Few men spoke to her with such blunt honesty. It unnerved her. Then you should know, she said carefully. This is work for me, nothing else. Duke gave the faintest nod, but there was something in his eyes, an intent, a quiet determination. That told her he had come deliberately, not for food, not for convenience, but for her. And that realization unsettled her more than any rumor she'd ever heard about him. Tanisha tried to hand the table off to another server, but Duke made it clear he wouldn't allow it. The maitre d' had barely opened his mouth to suggest someone else when Duke cut in smoothly, his gaze never leaving her. No, he said, his tone firm but calm. I want her to serve me. The room stilled for a second. That was the power of Duke Lindsay. He didn't raise his voice, but people obeyed. Reluctantly, the maitre d' nodded and backed away, leaving Tanisha to face him. She approached with practiced composure, though her pulse betrayed her. Fine. What would you like tonight? He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You tell me. What do you eat here when you get the chance? She bristled. I don't eat here. The cheapest dish costs half my rent. His eyes softened slightly. Then what would you eat if you could? The question unsettled her more than it should have. Guests rarely cared about her preferences. She was there to serve, not to be seen. I don't think about it, she muttered. Think about it now, he pressed, his voice low, even. One dish. Which one? Against her better judgment, she answered. The halibut. A faint smile touched his lips. Then I'll have that. She wrote it down quickly, irritated at the way he had pulled the answer from her so easily. But as she turned to leave, his next word stopped her. Do you always work this much? Her shoulders stiffened. It pays my tuition. What are you studying? Business administration, she replied curtly, hoping he'd drop it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. So one day, you'll be the one sitting here, and someone else will be carrying the tray. Tanisha froze, her eyes narrowing. She was used to men dismissing her goals, brushing them aside as naive dreams. Hearing him voice them as if they were possible felt strange, almost disarming. Maybe, she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. Duke didn't press further. He only nodded, as though he'd already seen the truth of it. For the rest of the evening, he kept asking small questions about her classes, about Brooklyn, about her late-night studying. Nothing intrusive, nothing inappropriate, but questions that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. And though she tried to brush it off as nothing, the attention felt different. Too different. The food arrived, carefully plated, but Duke hardly touched it. His attention lingered on Tanisha whenever she stopped at his table. She did her best to keep her focus on the job, refilling water glasses, checking in with other guests, but somehow she kept finding herself pulled back to him. When she returned to clear a bread plate, he asked, How much longer until you finish school? Tanisha hesitated, her hands steady even as her heart beat faster. 2 years, if I keep up the pace. That's a long time to balance work and study. She gave a small shrug. I don't have another choice. Tuition doesn't wait, and landlords don't care if you're chasing a degree. The bitterness in her tone surprised even her. She rarely shared this much with anyone outside her closest circle. But there was something in Duke's voice, something in the way he asked, that loosened the words she normally held back. Why business administration? He pressed, tilting his head. Because I don't want to work for anyone forever, she said firmly. I want to run something of my own, build something. Not just survive paycheck to paycheck. For a second she feared she'd said too much, revealed too much. Men like him didn't understand struggle. But when she looked up, his gaze wasn't mocking. It was respectful. That's ambitious, he said softly. Most people would settle. Most people don't have to fight for every inch, she shot back. Instead of flinching, Duke's lips pulled into the faintest smile. True. And yet you're still here, pushing through. His words settled over her like an unexpected warmth, but she fought to keep her guard. Compliments were easy. Belief was harder. Still, she couldn't deny the strange comfort in hearing her goals spoken aloud and not laughed at. Don't get it twisted, she said quickly, straightening. I don't need validation. I know what I'm working toward. I don't doubt that, Duke replied. His tone wasn't condescending. It was calm, measured, as though he had already seen the determination etched into her every move. For the rest of the evening, their exchanges became less about orders, and more about glimpses of who they were beyond the roles they played. She, the student clawing her way up. He, the man who had everything but still seemed profoundly empty. And beneath it all, something unspoken began to grow, small, fragile, but real. The restaurant had thinned out, leaving only a few late diners lingering over desserts and wine. Tanisha stacked menus at the podium, trying to shake the strange pull she felt toward Duke. His questions had unsettled her, not because they were invasive, but because they were careful, deliberate, and far too genuine. When she walked past his table again, he caught her eye. "Sit with me," he said, his tone quiet but steady. Her heart jolted, but her expression stayed cool. "I'm working." "No one will mind," he replied. "It's late. The staff is already closing down." She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "That's not how this works, Mr. Lindsay." For a moment, his gaze hardened, but then it softened into something she hadn't expected, something fragile. "I don't want company," he admitted, his voice lower now. "I want presence. Yours." The words knocked against her defenses, leaving her momentarily silent. She should have walked away. Every instinct screamed to keep distance between them, to treat him like every other wealthy client who blurred the line between service and intrusion. But the look in his eyes held no arrogance, no presumption. It was loneliness, raw and unpolished, sitting heavy on the shoulders of a man who had everything yet seemed to carry nothing at all. She steadied herself, forcing her walls back up. "Presence isn't free," she said firmly. "And I don't mean money, I mean trust, something you clearly don't give easily." His lips pressed together, the faintest crease forming between his brows. "You're right." That admission stopped her more than anything else could have. Men like him didn't say "you're right." They demanded, they persuaded, they commanded. But here he was, conceding, as if her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Tanisha inhaled deeply, then shook her head. "I won't sit, but I'll finish your table. That's all." She walked away, refusing to glance back, but inside, she wasn't as steady as she appeared. His loneliness had seeped through the cracks of her guard, reaching a part of her she didn't want to acknowledge. Because despite herself, she understood what it meant to be alone in a crowded room. And for the first time, she realized Duke Lindsay wasn't chasing her with power. He was reaching for her with need. By the time Tanisha clocked out, the dining room was quiet, its earlier sparkle replaced with the hush of closing routines. She tugged her coat tighter and stepped into the brisk night air, exhaling relief as the city's chaos swallowed the silence. But her relief faded quickly when she spotted the sleek black town car idling at the curb, and Duke standing beside it, his coat draped over one arm, as though he had been waiting. Her steps slowed. "You again," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. His lips curved faintly. "That sounds like bad luck. I told you before, I don't mix work with whatever this is." "I know," he said quietly. "This isn't that. Let me drive you home. It's late. Safer than the subway." She hesitated. The offer was practical, reasonable even, but she hated the way it implied she needed him. Her independence was her anchor, and letting him play rescuer chipped at that. "Duke, I can handle myself," she countered. "I don't doubt that," he replied, his tone steady. "But allow me, this once." Something in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't forceful or demanding. It was soft, almost pleading. Against her better judgment, she relented with a clipped, "Fine." Brooklyn Heights. Inside the car, the same heavy silence returned, though now it pulsed with an undercurrent neither dared name. She sat rigid, arms crossed, while he studied the passing city lights as though searching for words. When they neared her block, he leaned forward, his voice low. "Don't go in yet." She turned sharply. "Excuse me?" "My penthouse," he said. "Come see the view." Her brow furrowed. "Your view?" "The skyline," he clarified, his gaze locking onto hers. "From the Lindsay Tower. It's different when you're standing there. You'll never forget it." Her pulse quickened. She wasn't naive. She knew the undertone, the expectation that lingered beneath such invitations. And yet there was no arrogance in his face, only that same loneliness she had seen earlier, paired with something else, hope. Her lips parted, but no words came. She was torn between caution and curiosity, pride and the strange pull he had over her. The invitation lingered in the air, unanswered. The car rolled to a stop at the corner of her block, the driver's eyes steady on the road ahead, waiting for instructions. Tanisha's hand hovered over the door handle, her chest tight with indecision. The offer still hung in the air, heavier than the city's winter chill. "Come see my view." It should have been easy to refuse. Men like him offered windows into their world all the time, glittering distractions. Temporary escapes that ended the moment the door closed behind you. She'd promised herself she wouldn't get caught in that cycle. Yet here she was, pulse racing, caught between instinct and intrigue. Her eyes flicked toward Duke. He didn't lean closer, didn't smirk, didn't push. He sat still, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable but not predatory. He looked more like a man asking for company than a man demanding it. Still, she folded her arms tightly across her chest. "If this is your way of trying to impress me, it won't work." "I'm not trying to impress you," Duke said simply. "I'm trying to share something, that's all." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. He wasn't dangling wealth in front of her. He wasn't reminding her of who he was. He was offering a piece of himself, or at least what he thought might break through the walls between them. Her breath caught. Her mind screamed no, reminding her of the gossip, the whispers, the stereotypes she'd spent her life fighting. Yet her heart wavered. There was something about the way he looked at her, not as a server, not as a passing amusement, but as if she mattered in a way he hadn't felt in years. The driver cleared his throat softly, waiting. The city's neon glow bled into the car, painting the moment in sharp edges. Finally, Tanisha exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine. One time. That's it." Relief flickered in Duke's eyes, though he masked it quickly with a nod. "One time," he repeated, as though sealing an agreement neither of them fully understood. The car pulled away from Brooklyn Heights, turning back toward the heart of Manhattan. Tanisha's hands tightened in her lap, her chest heavy with anticipation. She didn't know what awaited her at the top of the Lindsay Tower, but she knew this. Nothing about her life would be the same after tonight. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the crown of the Lindsay Tower. The penthouse stretched out before Tanisha in sweeping glass walls that framed the Manhattan skyline like a living canvas. The city glittered below, alive with light, yet distant, as if it belonged to another world. She stepped forward slowly, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. "This is where you live." Her voice carried awe, though she tried to disguise it with indifference. Duke entered behind her, setting his keys on a marble console. Yes, too high for most, too quiet for others. The space was immaculate, furnished with clean lines and muted tones. It wasn't flashy. It was almost sterile, as though wealth had bought him everything except warmth. Tanisha walked toward the glass, resting her palm lightly against the cool surface. "You can see everything from up here." "Everything," Duke repeated, though his gaze wasn't on the skyline. It was on her. He moved to a bar tucked into the corner, uncorking a bottle of red. "Wine?" She turned, hesitating. "Are you trying to loosen me up?" His eyes lifted, calm but serious. "No, I'm offering you a glass. If you don't want it, say no." Her jaw tightened, then relaxed. She nodded once. "One." He poured, handing her the crystal glass with a steadiness that belied the faint tremor in his hand. When she took it, their fingers brushed, brief but sparking with something neither spoke aloud. Tanisha sipped slowly, letting the silence expand. But silence up here felt different. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy with possibility. "You asked me why I came back," Duke said finally, his voice softer than before. She tilted her head. "And?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because when you look at me, you don't see the empire. You see a man." Her chest tightened. Vulnerability didn't fit with the image of him she had carried. Billionaire, untouchable, untouchably cold. Yet here he was, stripped of that armor, confessing in a way that felt too raw. She swallowed, her heart beating faster. "Maybe that's because I don't need your empire." His lips curved faintly, but there was no arrogance in it. "Exactly." The skyline glowed around them, vast and endless, but inside the penthouse it felt like the world had narrowed to two people in a silence that pressed them closer with every passing second. The wine sat forgotten between them. Tanisha had drifted back toward the glass wall, staring down at the city pulsing below. Duke joined her, close enough that she could feel the quiet heat radiating from his body, yet he didn't reach for her. Up here, the city looks small, she murmured, her reflection overlapping with his in the glass. Small, he echoed, but still alive, like it doesn't care whether I'm here or not. She turned her head, catching the heaviness in his tone. For the first time since she met him, he didn't sound like a man in control. He sounded like someone standing on the edge, clinging to something unseen. You think money protects you, he continued, his voice lower now, but it doesn't stop the nights from feeling empty. It doesn't stop the ache. Her chest tightened at the honesty cutting through his words. He wasn't offering pity, nor was he asking for it. He was confessing. Without thinking, she whispered, I know what empty feels like. Their eyes locked, and the air between them shifted. It wasn't about power or seduction anymore. It was about recognition, two people staring at the same wound in different bodies. Duke moved slowly, raising his hand as though afraid she might pull away. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she didn't flinch. She let herself feel the gentleness in the touch, so different from the arrogance she had expected. Tanisha, he said softly, almost like a question. She tilted her face up toward him. Yes. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The first kiss was tentative, testing, as if seeking permission. The second carried urgency, breaking through walls both had built too high. Her hands gripped the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around her waist, anchoring her against him as the city lights blurred into nothing behind them. When he deepened the kiss, she responded without hesitation. Years of loneliness pressed into that moment, his grief, her guardedness both unraveling in the warmth of each other's embrace. By the time he led her toward the bedroom, she didn't feel like she was stepping into danger. She felt like she was stepping into a choice, one she made with her eyes open, her guard lowered not by wealth, but by truth. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the glow of the skyline bleeding through the glass walls. Tanisha stood at the threshold, her heart racing, every instinct screaming to turn back. Yet the warmth of his hand against hers kept her steady, pulling her forward. Duke stopped, turning to face her fully. His chest rose with uneven breaths, his jaw tight with restraint. We don't have to do this, he said, his voice rough. She swallowed hard. Then, why bring me here? His eyes softened. Because I wanted you to see me, not the man in the headlines, just me. Her guard faltered. In the quiet, she realized he wasn't hiding behind charm or power. He was stripped bare, confessing with nothing but his gaze. When he kissed her again, it was slower this time, a careful exploration. His hands traced her shoulders, her back, her arms, as if memorizing every line. She clutched at his shirt, not out of desperation but out of the strange need to. Feel something real, something that wasn't obligation, or survival, or pretense. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His voice came ragged, almost a plea. I don't want to forget this. Her breath hitched. Forget what? You, he said, his eyes burning into hers. I want to remember every second, every look, every touch, because for the first time in years I feel alive. The words undid her. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not without agenda, not without strings. She searched his face for deceit but found none, only raw need, tangled with fear. Her hands slid up his chest, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Then don't forget, she whispered back. Remember. Clothes fell between hurried kisses, each piece discarded not in haste, but in quiet surrender. When he lowered her onto the bed, his touch carried the reverence of a man who had been starved of tenderness for far too long. He asked between kisses, Is this okay? Do you want this? And each time she answered with trembling yeses, her voice breaking against his. The night deepened into something both fragile and consuming, stitched together by the one. Truth neither dared deny. Neither of them wanted to let this moment slip into memory alone. Morning crept into the penthouse in soft golden light, sliding across the glass walls and spilling onto the tangled sheets. Tanisha stirred, her body still warm from the night before, her cheek resting against Duke's shoulder. For a fleeting moment, she let herself lie still, listening to his steady breathing. He looked different in sleep, less guarded, less untouchable, almost human. But reality pressed in quickly. She couldn't afford to forget who he was, or who she was. He was Duke Lindsay, a man with wealth and power, a man whose world would never make space for someone like her. And she was Tanisha Brooks, a woman who had fought too hard to be reduced to a passing story in his life. Carefully she slid out from beneath his arm. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. She gathered her dress from the floor, slipping it over her skin with trembling hands, then pulled his crisp shirt from the chair and wrapped it around herself as she searched for her shoes. Her eyes flicked back to him. His face, usually so stern, looked peaceful now, touched by the morning light. For one dangerous second, she considered climbing back into bed, letting herself pretend this was more than it was. But she knew better. Safety with him would always be temporary. She spotted a notepad on the desk. Tearing off a sheet, she hesitated, pen poised. What words could possibly bridge the gap between them? In the end, she wrote simply, "Thank you for last night. It was beautiful. But we live in different worlds. Let's leave it that way." Her hand trembled as she placed the note on the nightstand. She stood there for a moment, watching him breathe, memorizing the image before forcing herself toward the door. The elevator ride down was quiet, the hum of the machine echoing her own pounding heartbeat. By the time she stepped into the cold Manhattan morning, the skyline loomed above her, sharp and merciless. She tightened her coat around her and walked quickly into the blur of the waking city. Behind her, high above in the penthouse, Duke Lindsay still slept, unaware that when he opened his eyes she would be gone. And with her departure, the fragile connection they had formed that night would become something neither could forget, no matter how hard they tried. The morning after she left the penthouse, Tanisha's world snapped back into its usual rhythm. The clatter of the subway, the chatter of neighbors arguing over rent, the faint smell of fried food drifting through her apartment walls, all reminders that she belonged here, in Brooklyn, not in some high-rise tower. She folded her work uniform neatly on her bed, pulling the apron strings tight around her waist before her shift. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed tired eyes and a face that gave nothing away. That was how she wanted it. What happened at the Lindsay Tower was hers alone, and no one else needed to know. When coworkers asked why she seemed distracted, she brushed it off with a quick smile. Didn't sleep well. At school, when her study partner noticed her zoning out, she muttered something about long hours at the restaurant. No one pressed too hard. Tanisha wasn't the type to spill her secrets. At night, though, when she lay in bed with her laptop open to online lectures, her mind betrayed her. She thought of the skyline shimmering through Duke's glass walls, of the way he touched her like she was the first real thing he'd felt in years. She thought of his voice, low and ragged, confessing he didn't want to forget, but she forced herself to shake it off. It was one night, she told herself. One night with a man whose world she would never be part of. A mistake, perhaps, or maybe a stolen moment she would tuck away and never revisit. Still, she found herself guarding the memory like a fragile secret. Not because she expected anything from him, she didn't, but because it felt like a spark of something she had never let herself believe in. Weeks passed, and she carried the memory silently, wearing her armor around everyone else. To her friends, she was the hard-working student who had no time for distractions. To her coworkers, she was the sharp, no-nonsense server who never mixed business with pleasure. No one guessed the truth. Tanisha had hidden plenty of things before, her struggles, her doubts, her pain. But this secret was heavier than any she had ever carried. And as the days ticked by, her body began to remind her that some secrets could not stay hidden forever. Life in Brooklyn gave Tanisha no room to slow down. She woke before sunrise, pulled on her uniform, and took the subway into Manhattan. After her restaurant shifts, she rushed to late-night classes. Bills stacked on her dresser, and tuition reminders filled her inbox. To anyone watching, she was the same focused young woman fighting for a better life. But small cracks began to show. At work, the scent of seafood that never used to bother her made her stomach churn. A whiff of wine one evening nearly sent her running to the restroom. At first, she chalked it up to exhaustion or stress. After all, she was juggling too much. Still, the signs became harder to ignore. Her appetite swung from cravings to complete disinterest. Her once reliable cycle didn't come. She told herself she was late because of stress, but when another week passed, worry pressed at her chest. By the time nausea hit her on the train one morning, forcing her to cover her mouth and dash out at the next stop, Tanisha knew she could no longer explain it away. On her next day off, she walked into a corner pharmacy. The aisles smelled faintly of detergent and plastic, and her hands shook as she picked up a box. She avoided the cashier's eyes, paid quickly, and stuffed the bag into her backpack. At home, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the test like it held her entire future inside. Her heart thudded so loud it drowned out the noise of her neighbors. With trembling fingers, she followed the instructions, then set it down on the bathroom counter. Minutes felt like hours. She sat against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, refusing to look until she had no choice. When she did, her breath caught in her throat. 2 bold lines stared back at her. Pregnant. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She dropped the test into the sink, gripping the counter for balance. Her mind raced, her studies, her job, her small apartment, her dreams of graduating. None of it matched the reality now staring her in the face. The memory of Duke's touch flooded her, sharper than ever. The billionaire who had opened up his loneliness to her was now tied to her in a way neither of them had planned. She pressed her palm against her stomach, whispering through the silence. What am I supposed to do now? Tanisha didn't sleep the night she saw those 2 lines. She lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her thoughts running in endless circles. Fear wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She was 24, barely making rent, fighting to keep her place in school. A child was nowhere in her plans. Her mind played out scenarios she wished she could erase. What if Duke thought she had done this on purpose? He was wealthy beyond measure, and men like him lived with suspicion. He had already admitted his desire for an heir. Would he see her pregnancy as some trap, a scheme to tie herself to his fortune? Her fear whispered cruel possibilities. He might reject her, deny her, or, worse, accuse her of being no different from those who chased his money. But her pride burned just as strong. She was not a pawn, and she would never beg a man for survival. She had worked every shift, studied every night, carried herself with dignity even when the world dismissed her. She didn't need his wealth to define her. Still, the truth gnawed at her. This wasn't just about her anymore. She placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the fragile life growing inside. She whispered softly, "You didn't ask for this. You deserve better than lies." The fear returned. How could she provide? How would she balance classes, work, and motherhood in a city that barely gave her room to breathe? She thought of her parents in Georgia, still struggling to pay off their own debts. She couldn't run back home and drop her burden on them. Her pride told her she could do this alone. Women before her had raised children with far less, but her fear reminded her that hiding the truth could rob her child of a father. A man who, beneath his wealth and guarded words, had shown her glimpses of real loneliness and pain. For every reason to stay silent, another reason pushed her toward honesty. She sat at her desk, staring at her textbooks, realizing nothing she studied prepared her for this choice. At last she whispered into the quiet night, "I'll face him. Whatever he thinks of me, I won't lie." Tanisha woke up the next morning with swollen eyes and a pounding head. She had cried herself into exhaustion, but when the sunlight broke through the thin curtains of her small Brooklyn apartment, something inside her shifted. Fear was still there, but clarity had joined it. She knew Duke Lindsay deserved to know. He wasn't just another man she could push out of her life. The night they spent together wasn't a mistake. It had been raw, unplanned, and real. And now, the proof of that night lived inside her. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching kids run to school while their parents hurried them along. She thought of the child she now carried. Would her baby ever know its father if she chose silence? Could she live with herself, raising a child who might one day ask, "Where's my dad?" Her pride told her she didn't need him. She could work harder, take more shifts, stretch her body until it broke if it meant providing for her child. But another voice, gentler and steadier, reminded her of Duke's honesty in the car that night. He hadn't lied about his illness. He hadn't hidden his need for connection. She whispered to herself, "He might doubt me, but at least he'll know the truth." The thought of facing him terrified her. She pictured his cold, controlled face hardening with suspicion. She imagined him accusing her of trapping him, of using his grief and vulnerability against him. That scene played out in her mind like a punishment. Yet she also remembered the way he had looked at her across the penthouse table, the way his hand had lingered. When it brushed hers, the way his walls had cracked just enough for her to see the lonely man behind them. If he turned her away, so be it. She would raise her child with her head held high. But if there was even the smallest chance he would stand beside her, her baby deserved that chance. That night, she sat at her desk and pulled out a pen. With shaky hands, she began writing the words she would later struggle to say face to face. She didn't know how he would respond, but she knew one thing for certain. Duke Lindsay would hear the truth directly from her. Tanisha folded the letter in half, then set it down on the table. Her hands trembled, She had written only a few lines, but each one felt like it had been carved out of her soul. "Duke, I need to see you. There's something important you should know." That was it. No long explanations. No pleading. She would say the rest in person. She pressed the paper flat, then pushed it aside. Fear crept back in, wrapping around her chest. She whispered aloud as though testing her courage, "If I tell him, I risk everything. If I don't, I raise this child alone." The weight of the decision pressed harder than any double shift ever had. Telling him meant opening herself to doubt, to accusations, maybe even rejection. Keeping the secret meant safety, control, but also dishonesty, and she had never been that kind of woman. Her phone buzzed with a reminder, another shift tonight. Life didn't slow down, even when her world tilted on its axis. She grabbed her apron, tucked the folded note into her bag, and paused by the mirror. Her reflection looked both fragile and strong at once. She whispered, almost as if speaking to her unborn child, "We'll face him, no matter what." Tanisha wasn't sure how Duke would react. Maybe he would think she had planned it all. Maybe he would walk away. But she also remembered the softness in his eyes the night he admitted his fear of dying without an heir. Maybe, just maybe, he would see this as a second chance. Her heart pounded as she slung her bag over her shoulder. One truth stood clear: this was no longer just about her pride or his illness. A new life was at stake. Before I continue with the next chapter, let me pause and ask you directly. If you were in Tanisha's position, would you tell Duke about the pregnancy, risking his doubt and rejection, or would you keep it secret to protect your peace? Share your answer in the comments. And don't forget to like this video. It helps us reach more people who love stories like this. The glass doors of Lindsay Tower loomed ahead, tall and gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Tanisha stopped at the curb, clutching her small purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had been here before, once, when Duke's driver had dropped her off. That night had been quiet, private, intimate. Today felt different. The tower wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, a reminder of the divide between his world and hers. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby buzzed with the usual rhythm of wealth, polished floors, security, guards in tailored suits, and assistants hustling past with tablets in hand. Eyes flicked to her as she approached the reception desk. She was dressed neatly but not expensively, her plain cardigan in black, skirt marking her as out of place in this world of power and precision. "I'm here to see Mr. Lindsay," she said firmly. The receptionist, a woman with red lipstick and an efficient smile, hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "But tell him Tanisha Brooks is here. He'll know." The woman tapped quickly on her keyboard, her brow lifting slightly in surprise. When the screen confirmed Duke's standing order, "Admit her without question." Moments later, one of his private assistants appeared to escort her upstairs. In the elevator, Tanisha's heart raced. She pressed a hand against her stomach. The words she had rehearsed over and over tangled in her throat. She wasn't here to beg or to explain herself endlessly. She was here to tell him the truth. The elevator doors slid open to the top floor, revealing Duke's office, wide glass, windows stretching from wall to wall, offering a view of Manhattan's skyline. He sat behind his desk, a stack of documents before him, but his eyes lifted instantly when she walked in. "Tanisha," he said slowly, standing. His voice carried both surprise and a quiet edge, as though her presence broke through the carefully controlled order of his day. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "I came because I need to tell you something that can't wait." He studied her, unreadable, then motioned toward the chair opposite his desk. "Go on." Tanisha sat, but she didn't fidget or shrink. She leaned forward, her hands folded tightly, her eyes locked on his. She was here to tell him the truth, no matter how he reacted. Tanisha's throat felt dry, but her voice didn't waver. She looked straight at him, refusing to break eye contact. "I'm pregnant," she said. "It's yours." The words hung in the air like a sudden strike of thunder. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hum of the city outside the glass walls. Duke's face didn't change immediately. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening, as though he was testing the weight of her words before responding. He had heard countless claims in his life, women desperate to tie themselves to his name, fortune hunters hoping for a payout. And now, this. "Are you sure?" His tone was measured, low, but the sharp edge cut through the space between them. "Are you certain it's mine?" Tanisha's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. "Yes, I'm certain." His gaze hardened, searching her face as if hunting for cracks in her certainty. You expect me to believe that after one night? Do you know how many women— She cut him off, her voice sharp, steady, fueled by the sting of his suspicion. Don't you dare put me in the same category as the women who throw themselves at you. I didn't come here to beg. I didn't come here to trap you. I came because this child deserves the truth, even if you doubt me. Her words landed heavy, striking through his guarded composure. Duke straightened, his hands clasped on the desk. He was used to control, to setting the tone of every exchange. But here she was, unshaken, throwing his mistrust back at him. You should understand something, Tanisha continued, her voice calmer now but firm. I don't need your money. I don't need your name. I can raise this child without you if I have to, but I wasn't going to lie or hide it. You deserve to know. For a moment Duke said nothing. His eyes shifted, flicking to the skyline beyond the window, then back to her. For a man who had built empires, who had survived business wars, this was the kind of battle he had never prepared for. Tanisha stood, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. I've told you what I came here to say. What you do with it is up to you. Duke rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a shadow across the desk. His voice grew harder, colder, stripped of the brief hesitation she'd seen before. You expect me to take your word for it? For all I know, you planned this. A billionaire in need of an heir. You knew exactly what you were doing. Tanisha's eyes flashed with fury. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. Planned this? Do you hear yourself, Duke? Do you think I wanted to be judged, shamed, and accused of chasing your fortune? Do you think this pregnancy was some scheme? His jaw tightened, the words spilling like a defense mechanism. You think I don't know the type? You think I haven't seen women try to tie themselves to me for a lifetime of comfort? You show up here, claiming to carry my child, and you expect me to— Enough. Her voice cut across the room, sharp as glass. She took a step closer, refusing to back down. I gave you my truth. You can spit it back in my face if you want, but don't you dare insult me with your money-driven fantasies. I am not for sale, and neither is this child. The heat in her words filled the office more than any argument he had ever endured in boardrooms or shareholder meetings. This was not business negotiation. This was dignity standing tall before him, fierce and unbending. Duke's anger faltered for a moment. His breathing grew heavier, his fingers pressed into the polished wood of his desk. She was unlike anyone he had ever dealt with. Most people bowed or bent when confronted with his suspicion. Tanisha stood firmer. You want proof? You'll have it, she said, her tone steady now, a contrast to the fire moments before. But until then, remember this. I don't need a dime from you. I don't want your penthouse, your cars, or your empire. I want respect. For me, and for the life growing inside me. Her words landed with force, stripping away the shield of wealth he often hid behind. Duke's mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came. For the first time, he looked shaken. Tanisha turned away, her chest rising and falling, her pride untouched. Duke finally found his voice, though it cracked under the weight of his own unease. If this is real, if you're really carrying my child, then name your price. Whatever you need, I'll provide it. Money, an apartment, medical bills covered in full. You won't have to lift a finger. Tanisha froze, then spun back to face him. The hurt in her eyes was clear, but her voice was sharp and steady. Do you think I'm here to negotiate a payout? Do you think this is about securing comfort for myself? Her words made him falter, but he pressed on, as if money had always been his shield. I can take care of you. Isn't that what you want? Isn't that why you came? No, Duke. She shook her head, her voice rising. I didn't drag myself here to bargain. I didn't come for your wealth or your pity. I came because this child deserves truth. Because no matter what you think of me, they deserve to know who their father is. Her hand pressed gently against her stomach, her chin lifting higher. I will raise this baby, with or without your help, but I won't raise them in a world where their father dismissed me as a liar or treated me like a problem to solve with a check. The silence that followed was suffocating. Duke's wealth had always silenced critics, won over enemies, or made problems disappear. But not her, not Tanisha. You say you want an heir, she continued, her tone cutting through the stillness. But heirs aren't born from contracts or convenience. They're born from respect, from honesty, from the courage to stand by the truth. Can you even give that, Duke? Or are you too afraid? Her words struck deeper than she intended. He shifted, unsettled, as if her voice exposed something raw inside him. Tanisha didn't wait for his reply. She straightened her shoulders and said, "I don't need your money. What I need is for you to look me in the eye and stop seeing me as a threat. I need you to respect me, not as a waitress, not as some desperate woman, but as the mother of your child." The fire in her voice filled the room. Duke lowered his gaze, stripped of the power he usually commanded so easily. The office had grown unbearably still. Tanisha stood at the door, her hand already on the handle. Duke tried to summon the authority that had built his empire, but every word she'd spoken still echoed in his head, stripping him bare. "Tanisha." His voice was softer now, no longer commanding, almost pleading. Wait, she didn't turn. Her back remained firm, her shoulders squared. "I came here with honesty," she said quietly. "And you met me with suspicion. That's your burden, not mine." Her words left no space for rebuttal. With one last breath, she pulled the door open and walked out, the click of her heels fading down the hallway. Duke stood frozen, watching the door swing shut. For years, his wealth had given him control. A snap of his fingers, and people obeyed. But Tanisha had walked away from him without hesitation, without fear. She hadn't begged, hadn't bargained. She had chosen herself. He sank into his leather chair, elbows braced on the desk, his head dropping into his hands. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His chest tightened, not just from the illness that shadowed him, but from something heavier, the thought that he might lose the one chance at family he had left. Her face haunted him, the way she pressed her hand protectively over her stomach, the steel in her voice when she said she didn't need his money. She wasn't bluffing. She would raise the child without him, and that terrified him more than anything. Alone in the silence of his towering office, Duke let the truth sink in. This wasn't about business or heirs or legacy. This was about a woman who had every reason to walk away and had chosen against all odds to tell him the truth anyway. And he had doubted her. His reflection in the glass wall mocked him, a man with everything yet too afraid to trust. His empire stretched across New York, but in that moment, Duke Lindsay had never felt smaller. The days after Tanisha walked out of his office stretched longer than any quarter Duke Lindsay had endured. Lindsay Tower remained a hive of activity, executives rushing, phones buzzing, deals closing. But for him, everything slowed to a crawl. His body was failing him, and the signs were no longer easy to ignore. What once started as fatigue now lingered in the form of dizzy spells, stabbing headaches, and waves of nausea that came without warning. Even the simple act of climbing the private staircase to his penthouse left him winded. He had built an empire on discipline and stamina, but now both were slipping through his fingers. And worse than the illness was the silence that followed him everywhere. The echo of his penthouse no longer carried the comfort of wealth. The vast windows overlooking Manhattan offered no relief. He would sit for hours staring at the city lights, trying to pretend he was still in control. Yet the truth was plain. For all his billions, he had no one to call when the pain struck hardest. Loneliness pressed in like an uninvited guest. Meetings ended, and employees filed out. But none stayed behind to ask how he was holding up. When he collapsed briefly in his office bathroom one evening, clutching the sink until his vision steadied, there was no one to notice. The world saw Duke Lindsay, the unshakable CEO. Only he knew the man who struggled to keep his hands from trembling when he signed documents. Every reminder of Tanisha deepened the ache. He remembered her eyes, steady and bold, as she told him she would raise the child alone. She had walked away from him without needing anything in return, leaving him to face the stark truth that money couldn't buy the one thing he wanted, connection. Nights became unbearable. His illness didn't just rob his strength, it robbed his sleep. At 3 a.m, he would find himself pacing, replaying every word of their confrontation, every look on her face. He knew what the city thought of him, a billionaire untouchable. Yet in his quietest hours, Duke Lindsay felt like the most vulnerable man alive. Duke tried burying himself in work. He reviewed reports, signed contracts, hosted board meetings, but no matter how much paperwork he stacked on his desk, the memory of Tanisha refused to leave him. Her words replayed like a broken record. "I don't need your money, Duke. I need respect." He could hear the firmness in her voice, the anger mixed with hurt, every time he closed his eyes. At first, he told himself it was pride keeping her so unyielding. He convinced himself she was like others before her, just clever enough to mask ambition with righteousness. But the more he replayed her face, the more the lie crumbled. She had been sincere. She had been direct. She had been honest, something his world of corporate masks and power deals rarely allowed. Late at night, flashbacks would grip him without warning. He remembered the night at the penthouse when she sat across from him with a glass of wine. She had leaned back, laughed nervously, then confessed how she was taking extra shifts to pay tuition. There had been no hidden agenda in her eyes. No calculation, only truth. Other memories stung harder. The way she pulled her hand back when he offered her a ride, as if she didn't trust his motives. The way she turned down his offer of help more than once, refusing to be indebted to him. That kind of independence haunted him now. The worst flashback came from the confrontation itself. When she told him she was pregnant, she had not looked away or tried to soften the blow. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce, her voice unwavering. That moment played in his mind until it became unbearable. She had been the one person who gave him truth without fear, and instead of valuing it, he accused her. Every echo of her honesty cut deeper than his illness. He had built a life surrounded by polished lies, investors pretending loyalty, executives feeding him what he wanted to hear. Yet the one woman who had given him unvarnished truth, he had pushed away. Now the torment came not from what she said, but from the knowledge that he might never hear it again. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled Duke's lungs as he sat in the private examination room of New York Presbyterian Hospital. He had been avoiding his appointments, skipping treatments, convincing himself he was strong enough to push through. But the pounding headaches and chest tightness had forced him back. Dr. Raymond, a man Duke had trusted for over a decade, flipped through the latest test results. His brow furrowed deeper with every page. Finally, he set the file down and looked Duke directly in the eye. "You're burning yourself out," Dr. Raymond said firmly. "Stress, lack of sleep, overworking. It's killing you faster than the illness itself." Duke adjusted his cufflinks, pretending indifference. "I don't have time to rest. My company—" The doctor cut him off. "This isn't about your company. This is about you. And let me be very clear, Duke, you need peace. If you don't find it, you won't survive another year." The words landed heavier than any boardroom loss. Peace. It was such a simple word, yet Duke realized he didn't even know what it felt like anymore. His days had been ruled by stock prices, corporate betrayals, whispered rumors, and now the gnawing regret of pushing Tanisha away. "Peace doesn't come from locking yourself in that office tower," Dr. Raymond continued. "It comes from who you allow close. The body follows the mind. If you carry turmoil, your health won't hold." Duke's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, but the truth was undeniable. The sleepless nights, the endless replay of Tanisha's words, the loneliness. In his penthouse, they all weighed heavier than his diagnosis. The doctor leaned forward. "You've always fought like a man who has everything to lose, but Duke, ask yourself this, what are you fighting for? Because right now, I don't see anything but a man running from himself." That question struck deeper than the warning. Duke had fought for his company, for his reputation, for control. But what good were those battles if he went home to silence every night? If the one person who had looked him in the eye with honesty wanted nothing to do with him? As he left the hospital, the doctor's words clung to him. "You need peace." The limousine rolled quietly down Fifth Avenue, but Duke barely noticed the city lights streaking past. His mind wasn't in New York. It was trapped in the silence of Tanisha's voice ringing through his memory. "You think I trapped you?" Her words echoed in every empty corner of his penthouse, every sleepless night, every moment of weakness. For weeks, he had told himself the same story, that he doubted her, that her sudden presence in his life, her strength, her beauty, was too good to be true, that she wanted his money, his name, his legacy. But as the doctor's warning replayed in his head, something shifted. He didn't doubt Tanisha. He doubted himself. The realization stung. He had spent years building an empire, but beneath the polished suits and billion-dollar towers, he had never healed from loss. His late wife's death had left him hollow, and deep down, he feared he wasn't capable of being loved again. When Tanisha walked into his life, full of conviction and pride, he projected his own fears onto her. In truth, it wasn't her honesty he questioned. It was his own worth. The memory of her standing in his office came back in sharp detail. She hadn't asked for his money. She hadn't begged for his approval. She had stood tall, even trembling, and told him the truth. That strength was real. That pride was real. She had given him the kind of honesty people with billions rarely ever received. And what had he done? He threw suspicion in her face. The limousine slowed at a red light, and Duke let out a long, unsteady breath. For the first time in months, his reflection in the tinted window looked like a stranger. A man who had everything, yet nothing at all. She deserved better, he admitted aloud, the words tasting bitter. She was never the liar. I was not a liar in the sense of deceit, but in the way he lied to himself, lied about his strength, lied about his ability to open his heart again. Tanisha had been right to walk away, and if he wanted even a chance at redemption, he would need to stop doubting her and start believing in himself. Duke stood by the wide glass window of his penthouse. The Manhattan skyline stretched out like an ocean of lights. For years he had drawn strength from this view, a reminder of what he had built from nothing. Tonight, it only reminded him of what he stood to lose. His doctor's warning still burned in his ears. You need peace. At first, he thought peace meant stepping back from the boardroom battles, the endless business wars that drained him. But now he understood. It wasn't business killing him. It was emptiness. Peace wasn't in money. Peace wasn't in power. Peace was in truth, and the only truth that had cut through his guarded life came from Tanisha. He turned from the window and stared at the letter she had left that morning after their night together. Her handwriting was careful, almost shy. I'll never forget what you gave me, your time, your honesty. But I can't stay in a place where I'm not trusted. Every line of it haunted him. Duke clenched his fist. For so long, he had fought battles to protect his empire. Now, for the first time, he realized the battle worth fighting wasn't for stocks or legacy. It was for the woman who refused to bend to his wealth. I won't lose her, he whispered, a fire building in his chest. The resolve hit him like a wave. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the suspicion or the words that cut her. But he could change what came next. He could prove to her, and to himself, that his love wasn't a transaction. His phone lit up with board meeting reminders, business calls waiting, but he ignored them. Tonight, none of it mattered. The heir he thought he wanted wasn't about continuing his name. It was about building a life with someone who made him believe again. And Tanisha was that person. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt a purpose that went beyond wealth. This wasn't about being remembered as a billionaire. This was about being remembered by the only woman whose opinion truly mattered. Duke squared his shoulders. Tomorrow, he wouldn't sit in silence anymore. Tomorrow, he would fight, not against her, but for her. The call came in the middle of the night. Duke was awake, sitting at his desk, unable to sleep, when his phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was urgent. Mr. Lindsay, it's about Tanisha. She's in labor. She's at Brooklyn Hospital. For a moment, Duke froze. The words punched through his chest. Labor. It was happening now. He pushed back from his desk, grabbed his coat, and didn't even wait for his driver. He stormed out of Lindsay Tower, his security detail scrambling to follow. His Bentley roared through the near-empty streets of Manhattan, racing across the bridge toward Brooklyn. Every red light felt like an enemy. Every second lost made his heart pound harder. What if something goes wrong? The thought clawed at him. He remembered the night his wife had gone into labor years ago. The fear, the anticipation, and the heartbreak that followed when she didn't survive. That wound had never healed, but tonight it reopened with brutal force. But this wasn't the past. This was Tanisha, and this was his child. By the time he burst into the hospital lobby, his tie was loose, his hair disheveled. He didn't care. The staff, stunned to see the billionaire CEO in such a state, pointed him toward the maternity ward. He ran down the corridor, the sound of his polished shoes echoing against the sterile floors. When he reached the room, he stopped at the door, breathless. Through the glass panel, he saw her. Tanisha lay on the hospital bed, sweat on her brow, gripping the rail with both hands as nurses rushed around her. Her face was contorted in pain, but her eyes burned with determination. Duke pressed his palm to the glass. He wanted to rush in, to be by her side, but fear rooted him. Would she even let him? After the things he had said, after doubting her, would she accept him standing there now? The doctor's voice boomed from inside. She's crowning. Push, Tanisha, push. Duke swallowed hard. His heart hammered, torn between guilt and hope. He whispered to himself almost like a prayer. Please, let them both be safe. The cries came first. Sharp, piercing, alive. Duke's knees almost gave out when he heard the sound. For a moment, everything around him blurred. The rush of nurses, the commands of the doctor, the beeping monitors. All he could hear was the wail of his newborn son. A nurse emerged with the small, swaddled baby, his cheeks red, his his fists clenched as if he was already prepared to fight the world. "Congratulations," she said softly, handing the child toward Tanisha. Duke's breath caught in his throat. He had seen boardrooms worth billions, stood on stages in front of powerful men, but he had never felt smaller. Then in this moment, watching a fragile new life being placed in the arms of the woman he had wronged. Tanisha's chest rose and fell rapidly as she looked at the baby for the first time. Despite her exhaustion, tears slipped down her face. She kissed the tiny forehead and whispered, "LeBron." The name struck Duke like a lightning bolt. She had already chosen it. Their son had a name. Duke stepped into the room slowly, uncertain if he even had the right. Tanisha looked up, her eyes heavy but sharp. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was a wall, but she didn't push him away either. The nurse turned to him. "Would you like to hold him, sir?" His throat tightened. He wanted to, but his hands trembled. For years, Duke Lindsay had signed contracts worth millions without a flinch. Tonight, he was afraid to hold 7 pounds of life. Finally, he reached out. The nurse placed the baby in his arms, guiding him carefully. The moment LeBron rested against his chest, Duke broke. Tears rolled down his face without restraint. His son's tiny fingers brushed his suit, and Duke whispered, "You're mine. I'm your father." The baby's cries softened, as if recognizing the voice. Duke looked at Tanisha then, his voice cracking. "He's perfect. You gave me the one thing I thought I'd never have again." For the first time, Tanisha didn't look at him with anger. Her face softened, though her guard was still there. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But in that room, for the first time, they shared something stronger than pride, love for the same child. For most of his life, Duke had been known for control. His board members respected it, competitors feared it, and employees depended on it. He walked into any room with an aura that silenced others. But that night in the hospital, control meant nothing. He sat in the corner chair, his son cradled against his chest, the boy's small breaths warming the expensive fabric of his shirt. Duke couldn't look away. He had memorized every feature already, the soft curve of his nose, the wrinkled forehead, the way his tiny fingers tried to grip the edge of the blanket. Each detail tore away the walls Duke had built for decades. He had thought wealth would secure his legacy, but now he understood this child was his legacy. Tanisha watched quietly from the hospital bed, her body weak yet her eyes alert. She saw something few had ever seen, Duke Lindsay stripped of power, stripped of pride, stripped of the armor he wore so well. He wasn't the man who owned towers across Manhattan. He wasn't the untouchable billionaire. He was a father, scared, grateful, undone. Duke lowered his head, pressing a kiss against his son's forehead. "You're my reason to keep living," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The words surprised even him. For months, he had prepared for death, convinced his illness would rob him of everything. Now, holding LeBron, he realized he wanted to fight harder than ever. Not for his wealth, not for his image, but for time to see his son's first steps, his first words, his first smile. He looked at Tanisha then, his eyes glistening. "I don't deserve this chance, but I'll spend whatever days I have proving I'm worthy of him." Tanisha blinked, unsure how to respond. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she couldn't deny what she saw. This wasn't the man who had doubted her. This wasn't the man who had thrown money as if it could buy her dignity. This was a man who had been broken down to his core, and in that breaking, had found something truer than all his riches. For the first time since their confrontation, she believed he might be capable of change. The hospital room grew quiet. Machines beeped softly, nurses moved in and out. But for Duke, the world had narrowed to Tanisha and the child in his arms. He shifted closer to her bedside, his usual commanding tone gone, replaced by hesitation. "I owe you something," he began, his voice low, almost unsure. Tanisha looked at him, guarded. He held her gaze anyway. "I accused you of trapping me. I questioned your honor. I treated you like every woman who ever wanted me for my money." He paused, swallowing hard. "You never asked me for anything. You only gave—" Tanisha turned her face away. "Words are easy, Duke. They don't erase what you said to me." He nodded slowly. "You're right, but I need you to hear this. I was wrong. I was scared, not of you, but of myself. I didn't believe I deserved someone like you, so I pushed you away, convinced it would hurt less if I doubted you first." Tanisha's chest tightened. No one had ever heard Duke Lindsay speak like this. The arrogance, the cold detachment, gone. He sounded like a man confessing his sins, desperate for absolution. He placed LeBron gently in her arms, his hands lingering for a moment. I can't take back what I said, but I can change what I do from here. I'll show up every day. Not because you owe me forgiveness, but because my son deserves a father who respects his mother. Tears stung her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. She wanted to stay strong, to hold on to her pride, yet hearing him say respect instead of ownership cut through her defenses. "Duke," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you even know how much you hurt me? You made me feel like I was nothing more than an opportunist. After everything, I still chose to tell you the truth because I wanted my son to know his father. And the first thing you gave me was doubt." His shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He didn't defend himself this time. "I hear you, and I accept that I broke something I may never fully repair. But let me try. Please." It wasn't a grand gesture. No contracts, no gifts, no promises of wealth. Just words, stripped of power, filled with sincerity. For the first time, Duke's apology sounded real. Change didn't happen in one grand sweep. It began with small, almost invisible steps. The same man who once built billion-dollar companies now learned how to hold a bottle at 2 a.m, fumbling in the dark as LeBron cried. Duke paced the penthouse with his son against his chest, whispering promises no one else could hear. He wasn't used to sleepless nights, but he endured them because Tanisha had carried the heavier burden already. At first, Tanisha kept her guard up. She didn't forget the accusations, the sting of his doubt, yet she noticed his persistence. He showed up at her apartment in Brooklyn with groceries, insisting she rest while he cooked. She tried to dismiss him, but he burned his hands scrambling eggs and still laughed at himself, making her laugh for the first time in weeks. His office staff whispered about the changes too. The once intimidating CEO no longer rushed home to an empty space. He scheduled meetings around LeBron's checkups, even carrying the infant into boardrooms when childcare fell through. Investors were stunned, but Duke never flinched. "This is my son," he said firmly, "and my time belongs to him first." Publicly, critics questioned Tanisha. Gossip blogs labeled her as a gold digger who struck fortune by accident. Paparazzi hounded her on the streets. But Duke handled it differently than she expected. At a charity gala, when a reporter sneered and asked if Tanisha was the waitress who trapped him, Duke's jaw tightened. He pulled Tanisha close and answered without hesitation. "She didn't trap me. She saved me. She gave me a reason to live when I thought I had none." Cameras flashed, but Tanisha's breath caught in her throat. That was the first time he defended her openly, and it silenced much of the noise. In private, his effort was even clearer. He learned how to rock LeBron to sleep, how to clean bottles, how to soothe a fever without panicking. He didn't leave those tasks to nannies or assistants. He wanted to learn them himself, to prove he was more than a man with wealth. Slowly, Tanisha's walls softened. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire fighting illness, but as a man determined to earn his place beside her. Redemption wasn't quick, but every late-night feeding, every public defense, every sacrifice drew him closer to the family he almost lost. The rooftop of Lindsay Tower had seen its share of power dinners and champagne celebrations, but never a moment like this. Strings of soft lights framed the Manhattan skyline, glowing against the night. Guests sat in neat rows, hushed as Tanisha walked forward in a simple white gown that caught the breeze. She wasn't draped in jewels or designer fabric, but she carried herself with a quiet grace that no luxury could buy. Duke stood waiting at the altar, his tuxedo crisp, but his eyes softer than anyone had ever seen. He looked thinner, a reminder of his battle with illness, yet he carried himself with strength. LeBron sat in a small seat beside a trusted friend, wide-eyed and dressed in a tiny bow tie, the true witness of this union. As Tanisha stepped closer, memories of their hardest days flashed in her mind. His doubt, her tears, the loneliness she thought she would never escape. Yet here he was, waiting, not as a CEO commanding a deal, but as a man humbled by love. When the officiant asked Duke to speak his vows, his voice trembled. "I once thought power was everything. I thought legacy was measured by buildings and numbers. But then I met you, Tanisha, and I realized my legacy isn't what I leave behind. It's who I stand beside. You gave me a son, but more than that, you gave me a reason to believe in myself again. Tonight, I don't marry you because I need an heir. I marry you because my heart has never belonged to anyone else." Tanisha blinked back tears. She held his hands and answered with steady conviction. "They said I wasn't worthy. They laughed at me for dreaming too big. But every trial led me here, to this moment with you. I don't promise perfection, but I promise honesty, forgiveness, and love. I promise to remind you every day that family is more than a name, it's a choice, and I choose you." When they kissed, applause broke out across the rooftop. For a moment, the world below seemed to pause, the city lights bowing to a love that had fought through pain, pride, and fear. Tanisha wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was his wife, his partner, his equal. The rooftop had never carried so much weight, or so much peace. The city stretched beneath them, endless lights flickering like a reminder of the lives that never once cared who Tanisha Brooks was. From this height, she could see the restaurant where she once carried trays for long hours, the subway station she used to race through, and the tiny apartment window where she once cried herself to sleep, wondering if life would ever change. She held Duke's hand tighter, her wedding band still strange against her skin, but her voice strong as she spoke words she had once only whispered to herself. "They called me unworthy," she said softly, her voice carrying even without a microphone. The crowd hushed, waiting. "They said girls like me don't marry men like him. They said my skin, my work uniform, and my dreams would never be enough. But look at us now." Her eyes flicked toward LeBron, who clapped his small hands at the sound of people cheering, though he didn't understand why. A smile tugged at Tanisha's lips. "I stand here, not because I fit their standards, but because love proved them wrong. I didn't beg for acceptance. I didn't lower myself to win a place in someone else's world. I chose to keep my dignity, and in the end, that dignity gave me everything." She turned to Duke, her eyes shining. "This marriage isn't about wealth, it isn't about power, it's about truth. You saw me when I had nothing. You doubted me and I walked away. But when you chose to fight for us, I knew we could build something real. Our son will grow up knowing his mother was never ashamed to stand tall, and his father was man enough to change." Tears glistened in Duke's eyes. He kissed her hand, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. The audience erupted in applause, but for Tanisha, the noise faded into something deeper, a final release of every judgment, every whisper, every doubt. Her narration wasn't for the guests. It wasn't even for Duke. It was for every girl who had been told she wasn't enough. Tonight, she had become the proof that she always was. Love had rewritten her story. The applause on the rooftop slowly faded into laughter, hugs, and soft music. Tanisha stood with Duke, LeBron cradled between them, their little family framed by the skyline. For once, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She was home, right here in this moment. Duke leaned toward her, whispering, "Thank you for believing in us, even when I failed to." She smiled, brushing her thumb over LeBron's cheek. "It wasn't about believing in us, Duke. It was about believing in myself. That's why we're standing here today." The guests began to disperse, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of their rooftop celebration. Tanisha stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke one final time. Not to the crowd in front of her, but to everyone beyond the screen. "If this story touched your heart," she said, her eyes locking with the lens comment, "love wins." Because that's what this journey was about. Love that survived doubt. Love that rose above pride. Love that refused to let fear have the final word. Her smile deepened as Duke placed his hand over hers. "Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe," she added warmly, "because every time you do, you help stories like ours reach someone who needs hope. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remind someone that their worth isn't defined by whispers or judgment, but by how deeply they love and how fiercely they hold on to it." LeBron babbled something, almost like his own little contribution to the moment, and the crowd laughed. Duke kissed the top of Tanisha's head, sealing the night with the promise that love had triumphed over every obstacle. The camera pulled back slowly, showing the three of them framed by the glittering skyline, a family forged through trial, pride, and forgiveness. The story that began with a confrontation in an office and grew through struggle and redemption had closed on a rooftop where vows were spoken and dignity stood taller than wealth. Tanisha's last words echoed softly, but powerfully. "Love wins, every time,